Hey guys, and welcome to another drawing tutorial by artincontext.org. My name is Matt, and in today's tutorial we will be covering how to draw rocks. Now, rocks are one of those really strange abstract features that can be really difficult to understand visually when they are not contextualized by surrounding features. However, they are also really beautiful and unique visual components that can not only be an addition to some beautiful landscape style drawings or other types of drawings, but when kind of understood as their own unique compositional structure, they can be utilized or used in isolation as a drawing that stands on their own. And in this particular tutorial, we'll be going through the process of how to draw a few rocks stacked on top of one another, and we'll also define the process of how to create that unique rock-like texture within a drawing that is both realistic and quite beautiful. Now, that being said, there are some fundamental things we first want to understand before going through a rock drawing, and this is where we can start working out how to utilize the concept of light in tandem with basic shapes. So for instance, if we were working with simple structures, very elementary structures such as trapeziums and rectangles and spheres, what we want to understand is that when the light source is present on one side, obviously this is going to cast a shadow on the other side. Now, the trick with creating a realistic representation of shadow is really in the way we define the shadows by the use of shading. There's different types of ways to shade, whether it's smooth or stippling or cross-hatching. It doesn't really matter. However, the intention is to create these seamless transitions or the seamless gradients from dark areas to light areas. And this is obviously going to be present on the surface area of the entire structure. However, when we first gauge the three-dimensional quality of the structure, what we are doing is we're understanding that the angles at which it is visible and how those angles are positioned towards the light source, this is obviously going to establish a very unique shadow formation on the surface area of that structure. So for instance, with very basic shapes or simple three-dimensional shapes like prisms and rectangles, what we're dealing with is kind of 90-degree angles. So this means that a light source can be quite present on one side of the shape, but then completely incapable of reaching the other side of the shape due to the positioning or the angle of the shape and how it's interacting with the light source. Now, I think when you're at a decent drawing level, you kind of understand intuitively how to represent these kinds of shadow formations on very rudimentary objects. However, when we start working with surface areas that aren't particularly flat or have a simple 90-degree angle, what tends to happen is that the grooves and indentations and the texture along the surface area starts to pick up shadow and light in the same process or in the same kind of fundamental physics of positioning. It's still going to obviously interact with the light source that is present on one side. However, with a quite very textural surface, the light is obviously going to illuminate more details within the surface area and therefore cast more shadows due to the indentations and bumps and protrusions and whatever the nature is of that surface area. And this is how we want to understand rocks. We want to understand that rocks are simple three-dimensional structures. However, their surface area has a lot more feature and textures as opposed to being this really flat surface. So once we understand the concept of light and how it interacts with three-dimensional objects, we can now proceed to drawing in our stack of rocks. Now, in this particular tutorial, we will be drawing rocks that are stacked on top of one another. So again, light is obviously going to interact with these structures and therefore they're going to cast shadows onto themselves, but the idea is to kind of approach the drawing process the same as if we were stacking simple fundamental three-dimensional objects on top of one another, and understanding just that the shadow formation is going to be a lot more present on the opposite side of the light source. Now, in this tutorial, we'll also be working with a reference image, and what this is going to do is it's going to help us understand the way in which we define the drawing process in relation to a realistic representation of rocks and how they interact with the light source. Now, the way in which we want to start is we want to start really simple with a light pencil, and this is where we start to kind of vaguely draw in the rocks. Now, the thing about rocks as well is that they're quite abstract in nature, which means we can get away with a lot of our own detailing or featuring, and that what I mean by that is adding features to the rock, because there's so many different types of rock. It's more a matter of understanding that fundamental concept of a kind of textured surface area, and then just the way the light source hits that surface area. So what we are doing is we're kind of basically distorting simple three-dimensional objects into a bit more of a morphed textural, less smoother three-dimensional object, and what that is basically is a rock. Now, with this particular drawing, what we want to do is we just want to proceed with kind of lightly drawing in the rock, and this is where we kind of work in the general formation of the rocks and how they are stacked together. A good idea for this period of time is to just take your time going back and forth between the reference image and your drawing, and simply kind of working out the outline of each rock, how large they are in relation to one another, and how they are stacked on top of one another. Now, as you continue with your light sketch of your pile of rocks and you go between your reference image and your drawing, some things to know that are kind of key about the idea of forming rocks. Now, again, rocks are what I would call a distortion of simple fundamental shapes. So you'll find that as we kind of go through the drawing process of sketching in these rocks, we'll find that some of them have a trapezoid-like shape, and some of them have more of a rectangular shape. Some of them have more of an oval-like shape, but they can kind of be reduced to fundamental shapes. The only difference is that they are slightly distorted with slightly more ridges and faces, giving them a variety of different surface areas, which brings me to the next thing. Rocks are also uniquely one of the very few geometric structures that you'll find in nature, in the sense that they have harsh, sharp edges. They are quite simplistic looking in their form. And this is something really unique to rocks, which also gives us kind of a advantage, or that knowledge kind of assists us in our drawing process, because it means that we can really play around with creating sharp lines, kind of sharp edges, creating these ridges. So these are two main things to bear in mind, that these structures are basically just morphed or distorted versions of simplistic objects, and that they have a variety of faces along their surface area, giving them this very unique geometric quality. Now, as we proceed with our pencil sketch of the rocks, what we want to start doing is we want to kind of start working through one rock at a time and kind of lightly placing in the lines and shadows as we slowly work from one rock to the other. We also want to think about the stack of rocks as a holistic structure, because what this means is that there's going to be shadows cast on rocks in the central area where they kind of overlap or are sitting on top of one another. So these are some things to think about, but the best approach here is to kind of go from one side of the drawing to the other. So starting with the bottom set of rocks, working on one rock at a time, and slowly starting to place in those main features, such as the distinct lines that define the edges and changes and shifts in the surface areas that define the shape a little bit more distinctly. We want to work with both line work and shading. Now, these are two things to also bear in mind within this process. There are more subtle indentations and bulges on the rock, and the way in which we can establish that is with shading. However, there are going to be more harsher edges, more 90-degree type sharp edges, and we would probably establish those with more refined line work. And this is where our observational skills start to play a really important role, because as we look at the reference image, we really want to pay attention to how these features, which are defined by lines and shadows, slowly merge into one another or connect to one another, and holistically and ultimately create the overall texture on the various surface areas of each rock. You really want to make sure you take your time with this, paying attention to the reference image and really looking at how these lines kind of connect to one another. It's going to be really important with how you obviously establish these features within the rock itself. That being said, again, rocks are really abstract, so we don't necessarily need to worry about being perfect. Again, the most important thing to think about is that a rock is a distortion of a simplistic fundamental object. Its surface areas are just more textural and therefore have slightly more detailing, and that the light source is going to interact with these features and details, and therefore obviously exposing all of these little shadow formations in the crevices and indentations and so on and so on. And this is what makes up the unique quality of a rock, this weird distorted geometric structure with a variety of shadow placements and lines due to the cracks and unique features on the surface area. Now, if you keep that in mind, the process of going through each rock one at a time doesn't necessarily need to be a perfect representation of each rock in the reference image. However, we do obviously want to draw in these rocks as best we can, but if we find ourselves kind of shaping them slightly differently, or the scale isn't perfect, that's okay. And this is the beautiful aspect of drawing rocks. They are so abstract, but if you get these fundamental concepts correct and kind of integrate them into the drawing, they will ultimately look realistic and end up looking quite beautiful as a rock feature. Now again, as we proceed with our pencil sketch, what we want to start realizing is that we can utilize different drawing techniques to define different types of features on the surface area of different rocks. Now, in this particular reference image, what we can see is that there is quite a unique combination of both smoother and softer curves in the rock, as well as these more harsh and distinct lines in the rock. And this is again a matter of angles. So rocks don't always have these really harsh distinctions that kind of shape the rock into different faces or give the rock different faces. But sometimes these rocks also have less details or less features on their faces, and what I mean by this is they don't necessarily have too many harsh edges. And the way in which we can represent this kind of subtle gradient in the surface area is more with shading. So we have shading and line work. Obviously, in moments where the rock have more harsh and distinct features along the surface area, we want to use line work to create these jagged effects to represent these harsh angles in the rock. But in other areas where rocks maybe have these more softer, smoother curves along their surface area, we want to use shading or smooth shading to define these areas because the lines are less distinct. So again, we really want to think about shadow formation, and when shadow formation is obviously dark, our line work or our shading marks tend to be darker, but when they are kind of less harsh on the rock, they can be a little bit more smoother, and this is often determined by the angles of the features in the rock. So when the rock has these harsh features, again, one side is obviously going to be illuminated, but the way in which we represent all the little shadowing formations developed by these harsh edges along the surface area of the rock is with more distinct line work or maybe harsher shading marks. So this is something to think about. What is the surface area of the rock? Do they have these more soft curves and more seamless transitions between indentations and protrusions along the surface area? And do we represent this with either line work or shading, and vice versa for rock features or surface areas that have a little bit more harsher details and more harsh features along the surface area of that rock. Now again, really just take your time. It's really important for you to analyze and look at the reference image, really consider how light is represented within the within the reference image, and then how we can represent this with these different drawing techniques in our rock drawing. Again, another thing to consider is that when we are drawing a pile of rocks, we are also trying to see it as a holistic drawing. And what I mean by that is these concepts of shadow formation are applied to how the rocks interact with one another as well. So for instance, in this particular drawing, we are drawing rocks stacked on one another, and what this is going to do is it's going to develop or define this quality of shadow formation between the rocks. So obviously, because the rocks are stacked on one another, light is going to struggle to penetrate the central cracks or gaps and openings between the rocks. So these areas are going to be slightly darker, and what this is also going to do is it's going to bring the rocks a little bit out and give them more three-dimensionality. And that is because what is happening here is there is depth being defined by the darkened background and the features or the rocks being slightly lighter, and that's obviously bringing the rocks out a little more. So yeah, that's the way in which depth is being defined. So again, continue with this process and take your time going through each rock one at a time before we start transitioning into using our pens as a means of adding more contrast and darkening these details in the rock. Now, once our pencil sketch is completely developed and we have kind of worked our way through each rock one at a time, we have worked on the features, we've added in some pencil shading, we are going to now transition into using ballpoint pen as a means of adding more contrast and darkening the features within the rock. Now, when we use a pen, a really good suggestion is to use ballpoint pen, and this is because ballpoint pen works very similar to a pencil. The reason being is because ballpoint pen kind of allows the ink to come out quite sparingly, so the ink doesn't necessarily come out too harsh, and therefore we can manage our shading process with a little bit more control and efficacy. So what we're going to do is we going to basically again go from one side of this rock drawing and slowly work our way through the entire drawing. This is where we're going to start going over our pencil details one rock at a time. Now, we are not trying to create or recreate new details. What we are trying to do is enhance the already sketched out drawing of a rock, basically going over those pencil marks and darkening them where they should be darker, or keeping them light where they should be lighter, and using our pen marks to do so in order to just enhance the features of the rock itself. Now, when you work with ballpoint pen, it's really important to kind of take your time building up layers. And what I mean by this is that we don't necessarily need to press hard and make these distinct lines. What we can do is, again, work it very similarly to the way in which we would a pencil, by kind of lightly sketching over the rock drawing, and then slowly working in darker details, and if they need to be darker, we go over those details and so on and so on. So again, now as we go through each rock at a time, we want to start paying attention for a second stage, kind of a re-engagement with the reference image and paying attention to the details. Our observational skills are particularly important for this last stage because, again, pen marks are quite volatile, so they're susceptible to permanent mistakes, and we want to try and avoid that as much as possible. And this is why we develop a pencil sketch first to kind of guide us in our pen drawing process, but then again we want to work in tandem with the reference image and kind of go back and forth, slowly working in these details one rock at a time. Now, some major things to think of, once again, in terms of how rocks are defined with these more harsh details and more subtle details, is that the rock is obviously a geometric structure or a distorted geometric structure that has a variety of textural qualities on its surface area. And what we want to do is we want to pay attention to how we can use line work and softer shading marks or softer line marks in order to represent these various features along the various surface areas of each rock. And the reason why we use ballpoint pen is because we can also create these seamless soft gradients in moments where that is necessary to create these more soft curves in the rock. So again, just go back and forth between your reference image. Make sure you also work over the pencil marks. This part of the drawing process is simply a matter of taking our time, refining details, enhancing them, going over our pencil marks, and making sure that we really just take our time with the drawing process. So another good thing when working with pen is to really make sure that you just keep some scrap paper nearby, and this is a really good way to just take away any excess ink. So what you do is you just scribble on some scrap paper to kind of get rid of any excess buildup of ink in the pen before making new marks. As we proceed with this drawing, again, something to think about is the dark areas or the shadowed areas where the rocks are kind of conglomerated together, and where it creates these little gaps between the pile of rocks, and these areas can be really dark. Again, light would obviously struggle to penetrate these areas, which means that they would kind of be highly shadowed, and therefore they will be quite dark, and this is also going to bring the rocks out. What we want to think about is that, again, the light source is obviously present on one side, so even these features we have drawn in with our pencils, we can actually darken them with our pens if need be, depending on which side the light source is present within the drawing. Now, working with your pen, again, is just the same as working with your pencil. It's simply a matter of taking your time, going through each rock one at a time, and kind of going over those details, slowly working over those details layer by layer. Now, obviously, we are trying to represent a pile of rocks through a drawing as seen in the reference image as accurately as possible. What we can also do is we can play around with adding in some features, and this is where you can kind of be a little bit creative. Once you understand those fundamental concepts, you know, that idea of a distorted geometric structure, creating harsh features along the surface area with line work, maybe creating softer features and gradients with some more smooth shading, maybe see how you can integrate more details into your own rock drawing as you proceed with your pen shading process. You don't need to be too crazy, but in moments where you feel maybe like an area is a little bit blank or something can be added, feel free to add something. Again, what we're trying to do is we're trying to define the three-dimensional qualities of these features along the surface areas of these various rocks. And the way in which we do that is obviously by line work, some shading, and creating these gradients and distinctions between shadowed areas and lit up areas in the rock. And then lastly, another thing to think about is actually knowing when to stop. Now, obviously, because we're trying to create a more realistic representation of shadowing along the surface area, we're going to have these line works and these little smaller details on the surface area of the rocks, even the exposed surface areas of these different rocks, those details will be slightly darker, and that's because these little crevices or little protrusions will be facing the shadowed side, which will result in a variety of these little dark marks even on the exposed surface areas in each rock. Now, another thing to consider is not putting too much detail or too much shading into the rock drawing, and this is where we start to be a little bit strategic or think or be mindful of how to utilize negative space as a means of creating highlights within the rock to represent those areas that are very exposed to the light source. So with rock drawings, in order to really give it that realistic quality, we really want to make sure that we are not over shading or over detailing the rock itself, but that we're also working or being mindful of how negative space can be used as a tool to create a distinction between tonal values represented in the drawing of the rock. So again, obviously, negative space is a common way to kind of represent highlights or the areas or surface areas in three-dimensional objects in drawings to define those areas that are most exposed to a light source. And the same is applied to our rock drawing here. So guys, that's basically the process of how to draw rocks. It's really important that you know that the main takeaway from this is taking your time. So obviously the fundamentals are this idea of three-dimensional objects that are distorted to have more surface areas or more features, and therefore how those features and the variety of surface areas interact with a light source. And this creates textured surface areas, and even those textured surface areas, if they are exposed to a light source, those small little features are going to cast shadows on the surface area, and therefore we can create those details by the utilization of drawing techniques such as shading and line work. And other than that, the most important thing is take your time, be patient, and also if you feel a little lethargic or tired or fatigue starts to build up, take a break. It's good to always come back to a drawing feeling a little bit more refreshed, because therefore you become a little bit more engaged and kind of go throughout the drawing process with a more mindful approach of all these ideas and concepts and how to apply them to the drawing process as you go. Otherwise, that is it. There's not really much more else to this process of drawing rocks. So now you understand the basic concepts and ideas to think about in terms of forming, refining, and ultimately detailing a rock drawing. And you also know now how to create your own rocks in order to, maybe enhance your own landscapes. Rocks, again, are a beautiful addition to various drawing ideas and can be easily implemented as a feature. So with that being said, I hope that this tutorial was really helpful. I hope that these principles can really assist you in your own drawing process. If you did find this video really helpful, please drop a like and a subscribe. Otherwise, until next time, cheers.